morning sun cast long shadows across the rice paddies of Yamamoto village when Second Lieutenant Robert Bobby Henderson's crippled P-51 Mustang began its final descent toward the mountains of central Honshu. It was September 4, 1944, and the 22-year-old pilot from Kansas had been flying escort for B-29 bombers, returning from a raid on Osaka when enemy fighters found his formation over the Japanese mainland. The acrid smell of burning hydraulic fluid filled Henderson's oxygen mask as he struggled to maintain control of his aircraft. His left wing was shredded by 20mm cannon fire from a Japanese Zero. The engine was losing oil pressure rapidly, and flames were beginning to lick at the cockpit area behind his seat. Through the cracked canopy, he could see terraced farmland rushing up to meet him, enemy territory, where capture meant almost certain death. "Mayday, mayday," he called into his radio microphone, though he knew no friendly forces could hear him this deep inside Japan. "Red Leader going down approximately 30 miles northeast of Osaka. Engine fire, no hydraulic control. Attempting emergency landing." The radio crackled with static and silence. Henderson was alone above a country where American airmen were considered war criminals deserving of execution, flying a dying aircraft toward people who had been taught to hate everything he represented. His training had been clear about the fate that awaited captured Allied pilots: torture, show trials, and eventual death at the hands of Japanese military authorities or enraged civilians. Below him, in the village of Yamamoto, 68-year-old Kenji Nakamura was tending his rice plants when the sound of aircraft engines drew his attention skyward. The elderly farmer, his weathered hands stained with mud from the irrigation channels, watched a smoking American fighter plane circle overhead like a wounded bird seeking a place to land. "American aircraft," he called to his neighbor, Ichiro Tanaka, who was working in an adjacent paddy field. "The pilot appears to be in trouble." Tanaka, a 45-year-old man whose two sons were serving with the Imperial Army in the Philippines, raised his straw hat to get a better view of the circling fighter. The plane was obviously damaged, trailing black smoke and flying erratically as the pilot searched for a suitable landing site among the narrow rice terraces. "He will not survive if the Kempeitai finds him," Tanaka observed quietly, referring to the military police who were notorious for their brutal treatment of captured Allied personnel, "or if the soldiers from the garrison discover him first." The comment reflected a reality that both farmers understood intimately. Official Japanese policy toward captured American airmen had hardened considerably since the beginning of strategic bombing campaigns against the home islands. Military authorities encouraged civilian participation in the capture and punishment of downed flyers, who were portrayed as terrorists responsible for killing innocent Japanese families. Yet something in the sight of the struggling pilot, perhaps the universal human recognition of someone facing death, stirred feelings that contradicted years of government propaganda. Nakamura found himself hoping the young American would be able to land safely, even though logic told him that the pilot's survival would bring danger to everyone in the village. Henderson's P-51 finally lost power completely as he approached a relatively flat area between two rice paddies. The Merlin engine seized with a grinding crash of metal, and the propeller stopped turning as the aircraft glided toward what he hoped would be a survivable crash landing. He had perhaps 30 seconds to prepare for impact, and for whatever would follow. "God help me," he whispered into his dead radio microphone as the ground rushed up to meet him. "If I survive this landing, they're going to kill me anyway." The Mustang hit the soft mud of the rice paddy with tremendous force, cartwheeling twice before coming to rest upside down in 3 feet of muddy water. The impact knocked Henderson unconscious momentarily, but the cold water seeping into the cockpit revived him quickly. Blood streamed from a gash on his forehead, his left shoulder felt dislocated, and his legs were trapped by twisted metal. But he was alive. The crash had occurred less than 200 yards from where Nakamura and Tanaka were working. Both farmers dropped their tools and ran toward the wreckage, arriving at the inverted aircraft within minutes. Through the shattered canopy, they could see the American pilot struggling to free himself from his harness, while muddy water continued to rise around him. "Help me," Henderson called weakly, not knowing if the approaching figures were friend or foe, but understanding that drowning in a rice paddy would be a particularly ignominious end to his military career. "Please, help me get out." Nakamura reached the cockpit first, assessing the situation with the practical eye of a man who had spent his life solving mechanical problems on his small farm. The pilot was injured and trapped, but the aircraft was stable and unlikely to explode. More importantly, he could hear voices in the distance. Other villagers were approaching, and soon the crash site would be crowded with witnesses. "Tanaka-san," Nakamura said urgently, "we must decide quickly. Do we help him escape, or do we wait for the authorities?" The question posed a dilemma that went to the heart of Japanese wartime society. Official duty demanded that they capture the American pilot and turn him over to military authorities for punishment. But both farmers had been raised with Buddhist principles that emphasized compassion for all living beings, and the sight of a wounded young man trapped in rising water stirred instincts that transcended nationalism. "Look at him," Tanaka replied, studying Henderson's young face through the broken canopy. "He is barely more than a boy, someone's son, like our own children serving far from home." The observation was profound in its simplicity. Despite months of propaganda depicting American airmen as monsters, the reality of seeing an injured pilot up close revealed only a frightened young man who reminded both farmers of their own sons. The transformation from abstract enemy to human being occurred in an instant, fundamentally changing how they would respond to his plight. Working together, Nakamura and Tanaka managed to break away enough of the shattered canopy to pull Henderson from the cockpit. The American pilot was semi-conscious, bleeding from multiple cuts, and obviously in shock from his injuries. He offered no resistance as they dragged him from the wreckage and carried him toward higher ground. "American," Nakamura said in broken English, pointing to Henderson and then to himself. "Friend. Safe." Henderson looked up at the two Japanese farmers with confusion and disbelief. His training had emphasized that Japanese civilians were as dangerous as soldiers, fanatically loyal to the emperor and eager to kill captured Americans. Yet these men had rescued him from certain drowning and were now offering assistance instead of turning him over to authorities. "Why?" he asked weakly, not expecting an answer that would make sense. But before either farmer could attempt a response, the sound of approaching voices indicated that other villagers were heading toward the crash site. Nakamura and Tanaka exchanged glances, understanding that they had perhaps minutes to decide the American pilot's fate and their own. The moment of decision had arrived, and whatever choice they made would determine whether compassion or hatred would guide their actions in the presence of their enemy. Within an hour of the crash, Henderson found himself hidden in the storage room beneath Nakamura's farmhouse, his wounds bandaged with strips of clean cotton and his muddy flight suit replaced with rough peasant clothing that made him look like any other Japanese farm worker from a distance. The transformation had been accomplished with efficiency that spoke to careful planning rather than spontaneous decision. "You must understand," explained Nakamura's daughter-in-law, Emiko, who spoke some English learned during her brief time at a Christian mission school before the war. "If the soldiers find you, they will not only kill you, they will punish our entire village for helping an enemy pilot." Henderson lay on a straw mattress in the cramped space beneath the house, trying to comprehend the magnitude of risk these people were taking on his behalf. The hiding place was ingeniously concealed behind stacked rice barrels, with ventilation provided by bamboo tubes that extended to the surface. Someone had obviously prepared this refuge in advance, suggesting that his rescue was not an isolated act of mercy. "Why are you helping me?" Henderson asked Emiko, whose kind face reminded him of his own sister back in Kansas. "Your government says American pilots are war criminals. Aren't you afraid of what will happen if they find out?" Emiko smiled sadly as she adjusted the oil lamp that provided the only light in the underground chamber. Her husband had been killed 2 years earlier when his transport ship was sunk by an American submarine, leaving her to care for their young son and elderly in-laws. By any measure of conventional loyalty, she should have handed Henderson over to authorities for revenge. "My husband died in this war," she said quietly, "but killing you will not bring him back. You are someone's son, someone's brother. Perhaps if Japanese pilots crash in your country, someone will show them the same mercy we show you." The philosophy reflected a Buddhist understanding of compassion that transcended national boundaries, but it also demonstrated remarkable courage in a society where such sentiments could be considered treasonous. Emiko and her family were risking everything on the belief that human dignity mattered more than political loyalty. Above ground, Nakamura was engaged in careful misdirection as Japanese soldiers from the nearby garrison arrived to investigate reports of an aircraft crash. Captain Yoshida, commanding the local unit, was methodical in his questioning of villagers about the American pilot's whereabouts. The aircraft fell in the rice paddy, Nakamura confirmed, pointing toward the wreckage that was now surrounded by soldiers. But the pilot was not inside when we arrived. Perhaps he was thrown clear during the crash and drowned in the irrigation channel. Captain Yoshida studied the elderly farmer's face for signs of deception, but Nakamura's expression remained neutral and cooperative. The story was plausible. Aircraft crashes often ejected pilots who were then swept away by currents or buried in mud. Search teams would look for a body, but in the maze of irrigation channels and rice paddies, a thorough search could take weeks. If you discover any trace of the American pilot, Yoshida warned, you must report it immediately. Harboring enemy personnel is treason punishable by death. This applies to every person in the village. The threat was clear and deadly serious. Japanese military law made no distinction between active collaboration with enemies and passive failure to report their presence. An entire community could be executed for the actions of a few individuals, creating collective responsibility that was designed to prevent exactly the kind of conspiracy that was now protecting Henderson. Yet even as Captain Yoshida made his threats, other villagers were involved in elaborate deceptions designed to conceal the American pilot's presence. Tanaka's wife, Hiroko, was washing blood from Henderson's flight suit in the irrigation channel behind her house, while their teenage daughter, Yuki, was disposing of equipment and personal effects that might reveal his identity. The conspiracy required constant vigilance and perfect coordination among people who had never planned for such a situation. Every villager who encountered Henderson had to maintain the deception, knowing that a single mistake could result in mass executions. The psychological pressure was enormous, yet the community maintained its protective silence. Dr. Watanabe, the village's elderly physician, visited Nakamura's house that evening under the pretense of treating the farmer's chronic back pain. The doctor's medical bag contained not only herbs and traditional remedies, but also modern bandages and antiseptic that he used to treat Henderson's injuries in the hidden chamber beneath the house. "Your shoulder is dislocated, but not broken," Watanabe diagnosed after a careful examination by lamplight. "The cuts will heal cleanly if kept clean and dry. You are fortunate. Aircraft crashes usually produce more serious injuries." Henderson submitted to treatment with growing amazement at the level of care he was receiving from people who should have been his sworn enemies. Dr. Watanabe's medical expertise rivaled anything he might have received from American military doctors, and the old physician's gentle manner suggested genuine concern for his patient's welfare. "Doctor," Henderson asked through Emiko's translation, "why are you risking your life to treat an enemy pilot? If they catch you helping me, won't they execute you along with everyone else?" Watanabe paused in his bandaging to consider the question carefully. The physician had served in the Russo-Japanese War 40 years earlier and had seen enough of warfare to understand its human costs on both sides. "I took an oath to preserve life and relieve suffering," he replied slowly. "That oath makes no mention of nationality or political allegiance. You are injured and in need of medical care. That is all that matters to a doctor." The response reflected professional ethics that transcended wartime propaganda, but it also demonstrated personal courage that Henderson was beginning to understand was more common in this village than military authorities would have believed possible. As his second night in hiding began, Henderson lay in the cramped underground chamber, listening to the sounds of family life above him. Children playing, adults conversing in low voices, the routine activities of people maintaining normal lives while concealing a secret that could cost them everything. Emiko brought him rice and vegetables prepared in the family kitchen, along with tea that was becoming increasingly precious as wartime shortages affected even basic commodities. The food was simple but nourishing, shared from family supplies that were already strained by rationing and disrupted agriculture. "How many people know I'm here?" Henderson asked as Emiko adjusted his hiding place for the night. 12 adults, she replied matter-of-factly, plus several children who have been told that you are a distant relative recovering from illness. The children believe this story because they want to believe it. It is easier than understanding that we are hiding someone the government wants to kill. The number of conspirators was staggering. 12 adults were actively participating in concealing Henderson's presence, while others were involved in peripheral deceptions designed to maintain the illusion that no American pilot had survived the crash. The level of coordination required was extraordinary, particularly in a small community where everyone knew everyone else's business. Yet the conspiracy held together through a combination of careful planning and shared commitment to values that transcended wartime nationalism. Each family had made a conscious decision to prioritize human compassion over political loyalty, understanding the risks but choosing mercy nonetheless. Henderson began to understand that his rescue was not a spontaneous act of individual kindness, but a collective decision by an entire community to reject the hatred that their government was promoting. The villagers of Yamamoto had chosen to see him as a human being rather than an enemy, and they were willing to risk everything to protect that choice. As he drifted off to sleep in his underground sanctuary, Henderson realized that he was witnessing something remarkable, a demonstration of human decency that transcended the boundaries of war and nationality. The people who should have been his enemies had instead become his protectors, offering living proof that compassion could survive even in the darkest circumstances of global conflict. 2 weeks into his hidden existence beneath the Nakamura farmhouse, Henderson had developed an intimate understanding of village life through the sounds that filtered down from above. He could identify individual family members by their footsteps, recognize the rhythm of daily routines, and sense the tension that grew each time military patrols visited the area. The constant fear was taking its toll on everyone involved in the conspiracy. Emiko had developed dark circles under her eyes from the stress of maintaining normal routines while managing the complex logistics of hiding an enemy pilot. Her young son, Taro, had begun asking questions about the sick relative living in the cellar, forcing his mother to construct increasingly elaborate explanations. "Uncle Bobby is very ill and cannot see sunlight," Emiko told the curious 8-year-old, using the American name that Henderson had taught her. "He needs complete rest and quiet to recover. You must never tell anyone about Uncle Bobby, or the bad medicine will not work." The explanation satisfied the child's curiosity while reinforcing the absolute secrecy required to maintain Henderson's safety. But the psychological burden of living a lie was affecting the entire household, particularly the elderly members who remembered a time when deception was not necessary for survival. Dr. Watanabe's weekly visits had become a highlight of Henderson's confined existence, providing not only medical care, but also news from the outside world that painted an increasingly dire picture of Japan's military situation. The physician brought reports of massive American air raids, naval defeats, and supply shortages that suggested the war was turning decisively against Japan. "The government claims we are winning great victories," Watanabe confided during one of his clandestine medical examinations, "but the evidence suggests otherwise. Food is becoming scarce, young men are dying in distant battles, and American bombers appear over our cities with increasing frequency." Henderson absorbed this information with mixed emotions. As an American serviceman, he was naturally pleased to hear that his country was gaining the upper hand in the Pacific War. But as someone whose life depended on the continued goodwill of Japanese civilians, he understood that military defeats might increase popular hatred toward American personnel. "Doctor," Henderson asked through Emiko's translation, "if Japan is losing the war, won't people blame American pilots like me for their suffering? Won't that make them more likely to turn me in?" Watanabe considered the question while checking Henderson's healing shoulder. The physician had been observing village attitudes toward the war and was beginning to detect subtle changes in popular sentiment as the reality of Japan's situation became undeniable. "Some people become more hateful when they are losing," he acknowledged, "but others become weary of fighting and begin to question whether the war is worth the suffering it brings. I believe this village has chosen wisdom over hatred." The comment proved prophetic as news arrived of increasingly devastating American air raids against Japanese cities. Villagers who had relatives in urban areas received reports of destruction that exceeded anything in Japanese experience, forcing them to confront the reality that their country was being systematically destroyed by American air power. Tanaka's elderly mother had fled from Tokyo after the massive incendiary raid that destroyed much of the city, arriving in Yamamoto with stories of devastation that challenged every assumption about Japanese military strength. Her presence created additional complications for the conspiracy protecting Henderson, as the traumatized woman might react unpredictably to discovering an American pilot in her son's village. "The entire Sumida district was burned," she reported during a family gathering that Henderson could hear through the floorboards above his hiding place. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their homes. American bombers came in waves for hours, dropping fire from the sky like demons. The description of strategic bombing's effects on Japanese civilians created moral complexity for Henderson, who understood that his fellow airmen were responsible for much of the destruction being described. Yet the villagers who were protecting him showed no sign of connecting his presence with the suffering of their urban relatives. Instead, the reports of urban devastation seemed to reinforce their commitment to treating Henderson with humanity, rather than seeking revenge for America's bombing campaigns. The villagers had chosen to separate the individual from the larger conflict, maintaining their protective conspiracy despite growing evidence of American military superiority. Captain Yoshida's periodic visits to the village had become routine, but each inspection brought the possibility of discovery that kept everyone involved in the conspiracy on edge. The military police officer was methodical in his searches, checking cellars, barns, and storage areas for any trace of the missing American pilot. The High Command believes the pilot may have survived his crash, Yoshida announced during his latest visit, addressing the assembled villagers in the central square. Intelligence suggests that American flyers are trained in survival techniques that would allow them to evade capture for extended periods. Anyone harboring such an individual commits treason against the Emperor. The threat was accompanied by enhanced search procedures that included bringing tracking dogs from the regional garrison. Henderson listened from his underground hiding place as the German shepherds sniffed around the farmhouse, their handlers directing them to investigate every possible concealment. The dogs had nearly discovered his presence when Emiko's quick thinking provided a crucial distraction. She had prepared a meal of grilled fish in the kitchen directly above Henderson's hiding place, creating strong food odors that masked any human scent that might have leaked from the concealed chamber. "The dogs are interested in the kitchen," one of the handlers reported to Captain Yoshida, "but that's natural, they smell cooking food." The close call demonstrated how precarious Henderson's situation remained, despite the villagers' elaborate precautions. A single mistake, an unexpected search, or a moment of bad luck could expose the conspiracy and bring death to everyone involved. Yet the villagers never wavered in their commitment to protecting him. Nakamura's family had grown attached to their hidden guest, treating him almost like an adopted relative who happened to speak a foreign language and require constant concealment from authorities. Yuki, Tanaka's teenage daughter, had begun practicing English with Henderson during her visits to his hiding place, using textbooks from her discontinued language classes to conduct whispered conversations that helped pass the long hours of confinement. "Teacher Henderson," she said during one of these sessions, "do you have family in America, wife, children?" Henderson pulled out his wallet, which had somehow survived the crash, and showed her photographs of his parents, his younger sister, and his girlfriend from college. The pictures made him seem more human to the villagers, reinforcing their emotional investment in his survival. "My parents have a farm in Kansas," he explained, pointing to a photograph of wheat fields that stretched to the horizon. "Much bigger than your rice paddies, but we grow grain instead of rice." The conversation revealed commonalities between American and Japanese rural life that transcended national boundaries. Both cultures valued family, hard work, and connection to the land, similarities that made it easier for the villagers to see Henderson as a person rather than an enemy. As autumn progressed, and Henderson's wounds healed under Dr. Watanabe's care, the question of his eventual fate became increasingly urgent. He could not remain hidden indefinitely, both for his own safety and for the protection of the villagers who were risking everything to shelter him. "Winter is coming," Emiko explained during one of their evening conversations. "Snow will make it impossible to move through the mountains safely. If you are going to attempt escape, it must be soon." Henderson understood the logic, but the prospect of leaving the safety of his underground sanctuary filled him with apprehension. The villagers had become his protectors and, in many ways, his friends. The thought of venturing into hostile territory where he would be hunted by soldiers and civilians alike was terrifying. More importantly, he had begun to understand that his presence was an increasing burden on people who had already sacrificed enormously on his behalf. The constant stress of maintaining the conspiracy was affecting everyone's health and well-being, while the risk of discovery grew with each passing day. The weight of secrets was becoming unbearable for a community that had chosen compassion over safety, and difficult decisions about Henderson's future could no longer be postponed. On October 15, 1944, exactly 6 weeks after his crash, Henderson received news that would change everything. American forces had landed in the Philippines, beginning what would become the final phase of the Pacific War. The information came through Dr. Watanabe, who had access to radio broadcasts from neutral countries that provided more accurate war news than Japanese government sources. The Americans have returned to the Philippines with a massive invasion force, the doctor reported during his weekly medical visit. Japanese resistance is collapsing across the Pacific. The war may end sooner than anyone expected. For Henderson, the news brought both hope and agonizing uncertainty. If American forces were advancing rapidly toward Japan, his chances of eventual rescue were improving dramatically. But the same military success might also trigger desperate Japanese measures against captured Allied personnel, making his situation more dangerous rather than safer. The villagers faced an equally complex dilemma. They had protected Henderson for 6 weeks at enormous personal risk, but the approaching end of the war raised new questions about the consequences of their actions. Would their mercy toward an enemy pilot be viewed as treasonous collaboration when Japanese authorities conducted post-war investigations? Nakamura convened a secret meeting of the conspiracy's core participants to discuss Henderson's future. The gathering took place in the Buddhist temple on the village's outskirts, where the elderly priest, Father Hayashi, had offered sanctuary for discussions that could not safely occur in private homes. "The situation is changing rapidly," Nakamura began, speaking in low tones despite the temple's isolation. "American forces are advancing, Japanese resistance is weakening, and our ability to maintain secrecy becomes more difficult each day." Tanaka nodded gravely, understanding the implications of prolonged concealment as military discipline began to break down throughout Japan. Desperate soldiers might conduct more thorough searches, while retreating units could implement scorched earth policies that would endanger entire communities. "We must help Henderson reach American lines," Tanaka declared, voicing what everyone understood but had been reluctant to acknowledge. "Keeping him here any longer endangers both him and our families." The decision to actively assist Henderson's escape represented a fundamental escalation in their conspiracy. Passive concealment could potentially be explained as fear or confusion, but actively helping an enemy pilot reach Allied forces constituted clear treason under any interpretation of Japanese military law. Yet the moral logic was compelling. Having saved Henderson's life and nursed him back to health, the villagers felt obligated to complete his rescue by helping him reach safety. The alternative, turning him loose to fend for himself in hostile territory, seemed like abandoning him to almost certain death. Dr. Watanabe had been quietly gathering intelligence about American positions and Japanese defensive preparations, using his medical practice as cover for traveling throughout the region. His assessment of escape routes was both encouraging and sobering. "American submarines are operating very close to the Japanese coast," he reported. "Intelligence suggests they sometimes extract special personnel from beaches on the eastern shore, but reaching the coast would require traveling 40 miles through territory patrolled by increasingly desperate Japanese forces. The journey would be extraordinarily dangerous for everyone involved. Henderson would need guides familiar with local terrain, while the villagers who assisted him would be unable to return to their homes if the escape attempt was discovered." Emiko volunteered to accompany Henderson on the most dangerous portion of the journey, despite having a young son who needed her care. Her English language skills and knowledge of coastal areas where her late husband had worked made her invaluable as a guide and interpreter. "I will go with him to the fishing village where my brother lives," she announced quietly. "Jiro knows the waters and can signal American submarines if they patrol near shore." The offer represented extraordinary courage from a woman who had already risked everything to protect Henderson. But it also reflected the deep personal bonds that had developed during 6 weeks of shared secrecy and mutual dependence. Henderson was overwhelmed by the scope of sacrifice these people were making on his behalf. They had fed him from their own limited supplies, treated his injuries with precious medical resources, and now were offering to risk their lives, helping him escape to safety. "I can't ask you to do this," he told Emiko, through tears that reflected both gratitude and guilt. "You've already done too much. If something happens to you because of me, I'll never forgive myself." Emiko smiled with the same gentle expression she used when comforting her son during thunderstorms. "You did not ask us to save you," she replied, We chose to help because it was the right thing to do. Now we choose to help you reach home for the same reason. The escape plan was carefully coordinated to minimize risks while maximizing Henderson's chances of reaching American forces. He would travel at night, guided by villagers who knew mountain paths that avoided major roads and military checkpoints. His peasant clothing and basic Japanese phrases, learned during his confinement, would help him blend in if encountered by casual observers. On the night of October 20th, Henderson emerged from his underground sanctuary for the first time in 6 weeks. The autumn air felt crisp against his face, and the sight of stars through the valley's opening brought tears to his eyes. Freedom, even temporary and dangerous freedom, was intoxicating after so long in confinement. Nakamura's entire family gathered to bid farewell to the American pilot who had become part of their household. Even young Taro, who still believed Henderson was a sick relative, sensed the gravity of the moment and bowed formally as he had been taught to honor departing guests. "Uncle Bobby," the boy said in careful English, "please get well soon and come back to visit us." Henderson knelt to embrace the child, understanding that he would probably never see any of these people again. The villagers had saved his life, protected him for 6 weeks, and were now sending him towards safety at enormous risk to themselves. "Tell him I will never forget his kindness," Henderson said to Emiko. "Tell him that someday, when this war is over, I will find a way to thank your family properly." The journey to the coast took 3 nights of careful travel through mountain paths that had been used by smugglers and refugees for centuries. Henderson was accompanied by Emiko and 2 young men from the village, who served as scouts and guards against Japanese patrols. The group moved in silence, communicating through hand signals and following trails that were barely visible even in daylight. They slept during the day in hidden caves and abandoned shrines, eating cold rice and pickled vegetables while listening for sounds of military activity. On the 3rd night, they reached the fishing village where Emiko's brother operated a small boat that had been modified for wartime fishing under severe government restrictions. Jiro had been expecting them and had already prepared a signal system designed to attract American submarine attention. "There," Jiro pointed toward the dark ocean. "American submarines sometimes patrol just beyond the reef. If we can signal them successfully, they might surface to investigate." The signaling procedure involved flashing coded lights from a clifftop position that was visible from several miles at sea. The codes had been learned from fishermen who had encountered American submarines during previous rescue operations. For 2 hours, Henderson and his rescuers flashed their signals into the darkness, hoping that somewhere beneath the waves, American submariners were watching for exactly such communication. The tension was excruciating, as each minute increased the risk of discovery by Japanese coastal patrols. Finally, at 03:47 hours on October 23rd, a dark shape surfaced near the reef. The USS Flasher, a Gato-class submarine conducting special operations along the Japanese coast. Within minutes, a rubber raft was moving toward shore, carrying American sailors who had come to retrieve their missing pilot. Henderson's farewell to his rescuers was brief but emotional. He embraced each villager, pressed his remaining personal possessions into their hands as inadequate tokens of gratitude, and promised to find some way to repay their extraordinary kindness. "Tell everyone in your village," he said to Emiko as the American sailors waited nearby, "that they saved more than one life. They saved my faith in human goodness. They proved that even in war, people can choose mercy over hatred." Emiko smiled through her tears, understanding that Henderson's survival would serve as living testimony to the power of compassion in the darkest circumstances. "Go home to your family," she replied. "Live a good life. That will be thanks enough." As the submarine disappeared beneath the Pacific waves, carrying Henderson towards safety and eventual reunion with American forces, the villagers of Yamamoto returned to their mountains with the knowledge that they had accomplished something remarkable. They had saved an enemy pilot, not because they were required to, but because they chose humanity over hatred. The war would end 9 months later with Japan's surrender, but the legacy of their choice would endure far longer. Henderson would return to Kansas, become a teacher, and spend the rest of his life telling the story of Japanese villagers who chose mercy when they could have chosen vengeance. Years later, when diplomatic relations between Japan and America were restored, Henderson would fulfill his promise to return. He would find the village of Yamamoto, reunite with the families who had saved him, and establish a scholarship fund that would help young Japanese students study in America. The pilot who had prepared for death had instead found life, hope, and living proof that human compassion could transcend the artificial boundaries of war and nationality. His story would become a testament to the power of individual choice in the face of collective hatred, and a reminder that mercy, once given, creates bonds that can last a lifetime. If this incredible story of unexpected mercy in wartime touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share these powerful stories of humanity triumphing over hatred. We specialize in uncovering the forgotten acts of courage and compassion that show the best of human nature, even in the darkest times. These stories remind us that ordinary people can make extraordinary choices that change lives forever. What moved you most about this story? The villagers' instant decision to help instead of harm, their willingness to risk everything for 6 weeks to protect a stranger, or perhaps the children who called him Uncle Bobby without knowing he was supposed to be their enemy? And here's something to consider. In a world torn apart by propaganda and hatred, what does it take for people to see through the lies and choose humanity instead? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing how these stories of wartime compassion resonate with you and what lessons they might hold for our world today.